There are some stories that begin with noise, with explosions of light or the clash of voices, but not this one. This one begins with a hush, with a boy sitting by a window staring out at the slow spread of stars. He did not yet know that the quiet thoughts in his chest would one day shape his life more than the adventures or the chaos. His name was Morty, though here, at the beginning, he felt more like a shadow learning how to step into the light. He had always been the kind of boy who lingered in the in-betweens. When the world grew loud, he stayed still. When the others hurried, he drifted. Some might have called him hesitant, but Morty knew it was something gentler. He was listening to the air, to the way silence itself could hum if you leaned close enough. The stars felt like old friends, even when he couldn't name their patterns. Sometimes he thought they whispered to him, though in tones too soft to be carried into waking life. It was in these quiet hours that Rick would stumble in. Rick, the grandfather who seemed to carry storms in his pockets, lighting in his veins, and sorrow tucked deep behind a careless grin. Morty never fully understood him, not then, not later, but he loved him in the simple, unquestioning way a child loves someone who feels both impossible and irreplaceable. Rick smelled of metal and smoke, his hands stained by ink and fire. When he spoke, the world tilted. Morty listened not because he understood, but because he felt. The house was never truly still when Rick was there. Machines hummed like lullabies through the night. Gears clicked softly behind closet doors. Bottles clinked against countertops. The faint tang of chemicals always hanging in the air. To Morty, these sounds became part of the wallpaper of life, soothing in their strangeness. Sometimes he would fall asleep to the low rhythm of Rick's tools working, as though his grandfather were stitching secret pathways between dreams. But Morty was more than a witness. Even then, before he understood his place, he was learning. He learned how to be small and patient in a world that always asked too much. He learned how to bend without breaking, how to listen without rushing to speak. Rick's brilliance was blinding, but Morty's softness was enduring. He didn't know it yet, but that endurance, the simple act of staying, would one day become its own kind of power. On nights when the stars pressed closer, Morty would wonder if his grandfather noticed him at all. Sometimes Rick looked right through him, lost in thoughts Morty couldn't touch, and yet there were moments, fleeting as sparks, when Morty felt something unspoken, an affection Rick could never say aloud. It was hidden in the way he adjusted a machine to be quieter, in the rare pause before a sharp word, in the faint, fragile sigh Rick would let slip when he thought no one was listening. One evening, Morty found himself awake long after the rest of the family had gone to bed. He wandered to the garage, drawn by that familiar hum. Rick was there, hunched over a device that glowed with a faint green shimmer. The boy didn't speak, he only watched, silent as the stars. Rick glanced up once, eyes red and tired, then smirked as if to say, "You're still here, huh?" No lecture followed, no explanation, just the two of them in the dim light, the air full of warmth and static. Morty felt as though something larger than himself had just unfolded, though he couldn't explain what. Later, in bed, Morty thought about that moment, about being seen without words, about standing in a room where he didn't need to be anything more than himself. He drifted to sleep with a sense that the story had begun, not the adventures with portals and strange worlds, but the deeper one, the one written in the silence between two mismatched souls, learning how to share the same sky. And as the boy dreamed, the stars outside flickered, as though they too were listening. The night after Morty watched Rick in the garage, stayed with him like a secret folded into his chest. He woke with the memories still glowing faintly, as though he had carried some of that green shimmer into his dreams. The stars that had whispered before now seemed closer, more alive. Morty found himself looking for patterns in them, not in the mathematical way Rick might have, but in the softer sense of stories. He wondered if each light was a person, if each silence between them was meant for someone to fill. School came and went, ordinary and heavy. Morty's days were filled with teachers' voices he only half heard, and the rustle of notebooks where he doodled stars instead of words. His friends saw him as quiet, maybe distracted, but Morty knew he was listening to something they could. When others talked of games and laughter, he found himself imagining the hum of Rick's machines, the strange comfort of their glow. It made him feel different, though not in the way of pride. More like he had a window inside him no one else could see. At home, Rick was unpredictable. Some days he would vanish for hours, even days, and Morty would sit by the window at night, eyes searching the sky as though he could call him back. Other times Rick would stumble into the kitchen, a bottle in one hand, muttering to himself while fiddling with something metallic in the other. Morty tried to understand. He didn't grasp the science, but he felt the rhythm of it, the way each creation carried part of Rick's loneliness. It was during one of those long evenings that Morty asked his first real question. Not about machines, not about formulas, but about the stars. "Do they talk to you too?" he whispered, almost embarrassed. Rick, slouched on the couch, raised an eyebrow. He didn't laugh, though Morty expected him to. Instead, Rick sighed, rubbed his eyes, and muttered something half serious, half deflecting. "They talk, Morty. They just don't say anything you want to hear." Morty didn't fully understand, but he kept the word. They stayed with him like a thread tied to his wrist, tugging softly whenever he looked upward. From then on, the stars became more than light to Morty. They were companions. He watched them the way one listens to an old song, not to find new meaning, but to feel the quiet promise inside it. When Rick disappeared into his own storms, Morty leaned on them, and when Rick returned, the boy found himself stronger, less lost, because he had learned how to sit in the silence without fear. There was one evening when the family gathered around the television, laughter and static filling the room. Morty glanced at Beth, at Summer, at Jerry fumbling with jokes that never landed. They all seemed distant, caught in their own currents, yet connected by a fragile thread of being together. Morty felt small, but also safe. He noticed the lines of worry in Beth's face soften when she looked at him, the way Summer teased him, but with a warmth hidden beneath it. Even Jerry's clumsy affection was a kind of anchor. Morty tucked these things into his heart. They were not adventures, but they were the kind of moments he would someday look back on when the world grew louder. That night, after the house quieted, Morty sat by his window again. He whispered to the stars, not expecting answers. He told them about school, about the hum of the machines, about how Rick's words sometimes cut deep but never seemed meant to. He wondered aloud if he was supposed to be more than this, just a boy caught between brilliance and silence. The stars listened, and in that listening, Morty felt whole. What he didn't know was that these whispers, these soft conversations with the sky, were shaping him. They were teaching him patience, resilience, and the courage to believe in feelings, even when they seemed small. He was growing, not through grand revelations, but through the quiet act of noticing. He carried his questions like lanterns, glowing faintly in the dark, waiting for the time when their light would guide him forward. And as he drifted into sleep, Morty felt a subtle shift, like the story was slowly unfolding beneath his feet, carrying him towards something he could not yet name. The habit of whispering to the stars stayed with Morty, weaving itself into his nights like a secret ritual. Yet as much as the sky gave him comfort, the hum of Rick's machines called to him with an equal pull. The garage was never silent, never still. Even when Rick wasn't there, it breathed, a steady rhythm of clicks, low vibrations, and faint whirs, as though it had a heart of its own. Morty often lingered by the doorway, careful not to disturb, simply listening. The sounds felt strangely alive, like lullabies made not of melody but of movement. He didn't understand what each device was for. Some blinked with a soft green glow. Others spun gently as though tracing invisible circles in the air. There were bottles and wires scattered across the floor, and the faint smell of metal always hung in the air. To most it might have looked like chaos. To Morty, it was oddly soothing. Each unfinished invention carried a rhythm, a strange music that seemed to echo Rick's moods. When Rick was restless, the machines sparked and crackled. When he was calm, they hummed low and steady, like the sound of rain against the window. Morty grew to love those sounds. They told him stories Rick never spoke aloud. Inventions were Rick's way of feeling without words, and Morty sensed it even if he couldn't explain it. Sometimes he imagined each machine as a fragment of Rick's heart, broken in places, brilliant in others, always reaching for something just out of sight. One night, Morty dared to step inside. Rick was asleep in his chair, a bottle tipped on its side, the faint rise and fall of his chest softened by snores. The machines still whispered, their glow wrapping the room in shifting shadows. Morty moved quietly, his fingers trailing across the edge of a workbench. A small device buzzed faintly under his touch. No bigger than a toy, shaped like a cube, with a light blinking slowly at its center. He held it for a moment, and in that blink, bright, dim, bright again, he felt almost as though it were breathing with him. Rick stirred, and Morty froze. But instead of waking sharply, Rick only sighed and muttered something under his breath. Words Morty couldn't catch. He set the cube down gently and backed away, but something had changed. For the first time, Morty didn't feel like a stranger in the garage. He felt part of it, as though the machines had welcomed him into their chorus. In the days that followed, Morty began to notice how those hums and clicks stayed with him, even outside the garage. At school, when his mind wandered, he could almost hear them. When he sat by the window at night, they echoed faintly beneath the stars, merging into a single lullaby. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't something he could explain. It was more a feeling, a language between himself, the machines, and the silence of the universe. Rick, though never one for gentle explanations, seemed to notice Morty's growing presence in the garage. He didn't scold him. He didn't forbid him from being there. Instead, one evening, Rick handed him a small tool without looking up, grumbling, "Hold this steady." Morty obeyed, his hands trembling slightly at first, but soon finding calm. That moment was brief, almost forgettable, yet Morty carried it like a treasure. It was the first time Rick had invited him into the rhythm instead of leaving him at the edge of it. That night, Morty lay awake longer than usual. The machine's hum was still in his ears, blending with the memory of Rick's unspoken trust. He thought about the cube, about the soft, blinking light that had seemed to breathe with him. He thought about how even machines, born of wires and metal, could carry echoes of something tender, and he wondered if maybe, just maybe, Rick had always known he was listening. As sleep finally took him, Morty dreamed of stars and machines merging together, constellations humming like engines, galaxies blinking like quiet signals in the dark. It was a dream of belonging, of finding a place in the strange balance between chaos and calm. And though he did not yet understand where that balance would lead, Morty felt the faintest certainty that he was beginning to grow into it. The dream of stars and machines lingered long after Morty woke, a soft haze that seemed to follow him into the morning. It colored the way he looked at everything, the flicker of sunlight through the curtains, the hum of the refrigerator, even the muffled voices of his family drifting down the hallway. Each sound felt part of the same quiet rhythm, like the machines in the garage had stretched their lullaby into the rest of the house. Morty carried that rhythm through his days. At school, when the teacher's voice blurred into a drone, he thought of the soft blink of the cube, of the way it seemed to breathe with him. On the walk home, he noticed how the wind rattled the branches like loose wires, how the cars passing by hummed like engines searching for purpose. Even the pauses between words at the dinner table seemed alive with the same hidden music. He began to see that life was not only in the loud or the extraordinary, it was tucked gently inside the ordinary moments, waiting for someone to listen. Rick noticed in his own way, though he never said so, his eyes lingered on Morty longer when the boy was nearby, as if he sensed something shifting. He would hand Morty tools without explanation, trust him with small tasks, then mutter under his breath when Morty's hands trembled, but never truly scold him. These moments were brief, but they became threads that stitched the two of them together. Morty wasn't just watching anymore, he was part of the rhythm, however quietly. But it was not always easy. Rick's storms were unpredictable. There were days when the garage filled with the sharp crack of frustration, when bottles rolled across the floor, and Rick's voice rose in anger at invisible problems. Morty would retreat to the corner then, small and silent, unsure if he belonged at all. And yet, even in those moments, he never left completely. Something in him knew that storms passed, and beneath them, the hum always remained. One evening after such a storm, Morty found Rick sitting quietly, the garage unusually still. The machines were silent, half-finished projects, lying open like books with no endings. Morty sat nearby without speaking. For a long time neither of them moved. Finally Rick exhaled and muttered, "Sometimes the in-betweens are all we've got, Morty." He didn't explain what he meant, and Morty didn't ask. But the words settled into him like seeds, growing roots in the silence. From then on, Morty began to treasure the in-between moments more than ever. The evenings when the family sat together, even if distracted, the sound of Summer's laughter echoing faintly down the hallway, Beth's tired but affectionate smile when she caught him watching her, even Jerry's awkward attempts at jokes, clumsy but warm in their own way. Morty realized that these small fragments mattered more than any grand adventure. They were proof of being together, even when none of them quite knew how to say it. That night he returned to his window, as he always did. The stars felt closer, their light softer, as if they too were leaning in to listen. He whispered to them about the machines, about Rick's storms, about the words that had been left hanging in the air. He told them how much he wished he could hold these small moments forever, to keep them safe from the chaos that always seemed to follow. The stars, as always, did not answer, but their silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that held space for his heart. Morty lay down and closed his eyes, the hum of memory carrying him into sleep. He dreamed again, but this time not of stars or machines. He dreamed of his family gathered in the living room, light spilling across their faces. He dreamed of Rick, not storming or building, but sitting quietly beside him, the faintest trace of peace in his eyes. It was not a dream of adventure. It was a dream of being, of belonging. And as Morty drifted deeper, it felt less like a dream and more like a promise. One the future would test, but never fully erase. The dream of belonging clung to Morty long after he awoke, yet it was in the waking hours that he first began to understand how fragile those moments truly were. The family dinners, the laughter echoing faintly from Summer's room, even the hushed conversations between Beth and Jerry, all of it was easily overshadowed whenever Rick pulled him back into his orbit. Rick's world was vast and unpredictable, stitched with wonders and dangers Morty could hardly name. But sometimes, even for a boy who loved and feared his grandfather in equal measure, it was simply too much. It happened on a day that began like any other. Morty was at school, his mind wandering between notes in his notebook and the faint rhythm of Rick's machines still alive in his memory. When the final bell rang, he trudged home, already expecting Rick to be waiting with some new plan, some hurried demand to grab his backpack and go. And indeed, when Morty stepped into the house, Rick was there, eyes sharp, voice quick, gesturing toward the garage where the portal gun already hummed with green light. "Come on, Morty," Rick urged, impatience lacing his tone. "We've got somewhere to be." "Don't stand there like an idiot. Grab your shoes." Morty froze, staring at the swirling glow of the portal. He had gone through it countless times before, sometimes with awe, sometimes with dread, but always because Rick expected him to. His chest tightened as the weight of all those moments pressed on him. The near misses, the confusion, the way his quiet longings always had to bend around Rick's storms, the stars in his dreams, the hum of the machines, even his family's laughter, all of it flickered before him, reminding him of the stillness he so rarely allowed himself. And for the first time, Morty whispered the word he had never dared to say. "No." The sound was so soft, he almost didn't hear it himself, but it was enough. Rick turned, frowning as though the very idea had broken the air between them. "What do you mean? No. Morty, we don't have time for—" Morty swallowed, his voice trembling but steady enough to hold. "I don't want to go right now." Rick blinked at him, caught between anger and disbelief. For a moment, Morty thought he might explode, unleash a storm that would send him scrambling into the portal just to make it stop. But Rick only stared, his mouth half open, the words caught somewhere in his throat. Finally, he scoffed, turned back to the machine, and muttered, "Fine. Sit here and rot if you want." Then he stepped into the green light and was gone. Morty stood there, his heart pounding, the silence that followed almost deafening. He expected guilt to crash down on him, but instead there was a strange stillness, a fragile peace. He sat down at the kitchen table, listening to the faint hum of the portal fading away, and for the first time he felt the weight of his own choice. It wasn't rebellion, not really. It wasn't anger. It was simply a moment of listening to himself. Later that night, he sat by his window again, whispering to the stars. He told them what he had done, how strange and terrifying it had felt, and how a part of him worried Rick might not forgive him, but beneath that worry was something else, something new, a sense that he had drawn a line, however faint, between himself and the endless pull of Rick's world. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew it mattered. The stars, as always, gave no answer, but their silence seemed to glow with quiet approval, like lanterns hung in the night. Morty leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the stillness carry him to sleep, the faint echo of his own whispered "no" becoming a promise to himself that he was slowly learning how to keep. The memory of that single word, so small, so fragile, followed Morty like a soft echo in the days that came after. Saying no to Rick hadn't shattered anything, not yet, but it had left a trace, a ripple that seemed to move quietly through him. He found himself standing a little differently, speaking a little more clearly, as though some hidden piece of him had stepped forward at last. It wasn't defiance that filled him, but a strange kind of steadiness, the calm weight of realizing he could choose. Rick, for his part, didn't mention it. When he returned later that night, smelling faintly of smoke and strange metals, he muttered about calibrations and tossed aside a half-empty flask, never looking directly at Morty. If the refusal had struck him, he buried it deep beneath layers of sarcasm and distraction. Morty noticed, but he didn't push. It was enough for him to know that the moment had happened, and that he hadn't disappeared for speaking it. What Morty didn't expect was the quiet strength that grew from there. It showed itself in small ways. At school, when he was asked to read aloud, his voice didn't tremble quite as much. At home, when Summer teased him, he smiled instead of shrinking back. Even with Jerry's fumbling, well-meaning advice, Morty found a way to listen without feeling swallowed by it. He was learning that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it was a whisper that simply refused to fade. The garage, too, seemed different now. Rick still worked furiously, his hands moving with restless energy, but Morty no longer felt like a shadow at the edge of it all. When Rick shoved a tool into his hand, or told him to hold this steady, Morty didn't panic. He steadied himself, his fingers finding their place, his breathing aligning with the hum of the machines. It wasn't brilliance that guided him, but patience. He discovered that his softness, his willingness to listen, to stay calm in the noise, was its own kind of power. One evening, as Rick adjusted the settings on a device that sparked with faint blue light, he muttered something almost to himself. "You've got a steady hand, Morty." The words were offhand, careless, but Morty felt them sink deep. It wasn't praise in the way most would think of it, but it was acknowledgement, and that was rarer than any medal. Morty held on to it, like a lantern against the dark. Later, lying in bed, he thought about what it meant to be strong. He knew he would never be like Rick, brilliant, reckless, burning like a star that consumed everything around it. But maybe he wasn't meant to be. His strength was quieter, slower, more enduring. Where Rick leapt into the fire, Morty could stand in the smoke and breathe through it. Where Rick pushed, Morty could hold. Where Rick raged, Morty could endure. And in that balance, there was something powerful, something even Rick, with all his genius, might one day need. He whispered these thoughts to the stars as he always did, his voice barely more than breath. "Maybe being soft isn't weak," he said. "Maybe it's the only way to keep standing." The stars, silent and endless, seemed to glimmer a little brighter at his words, as though agreeing in their own wordless way. And so Morty closed his eyes, drifting into sleep with a new kind of certainty in his chest. He wasn't a shadow, he wasn't just following, he was something different, something that could bend without breaking, something that could carry gentleness even when the world tried to crush it. It was the beginning of a strength he did not yet fully understand, but it was there waiting quietly, like a seed beneath the soil. The mornings felt different now, though Morty couldn't explain why. He would sit at the breakfast table, spoon in hand, watching the slow rhythm of his family's lives unfolding around him. Beth, always moving with quiet precision, filling her cup with coffee before heading off to the clinic. Summer, her voice sharp with sarcasm, scrolling through her phone as though the world lived in its glow. And Jerry, fumbling, uncertain, but trying in his own way to stitch himself into their days. For so long, Morty had sat there as if unseen, a blur in the corner of their hurried routines. But now, after that small refusal to Rick, after the quiet realization of his own strength, he began to notice threads where before he had seen only fragments. He realized that Beth's stern words were not coldness, but an armor she wore against the weight of responsibility. He saw how Summer's sharp tongue was less cruelty than a shield, keeping her from being swallowed by the same shadows Morty sometimes carried. And Jerry, awkward, faltering Jerry, was not just weak, but yearning to be needed, even if he never quite found the right way to show it. Morty began to see all of them, not as forces pressing against him, but as people, fragile in their own ways, carrying burdens that bent their backs just as his did. It was during one quiet evening that this awareness truly deepened. Beth had returned late, exhaustion heavy on her face. Summer was locked in her room, music spilling faintly through the walls. Jerry was pretending to fix something on the television, though his sighs gave away his frustration. Morty lingered in the living room, watching the spaces between them, the silences that spoke louder than words. For the first time, he felt not only the weight of his own place in the family, but the truth that they too needed someone to steady them. When Beth sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she rubbed her eyes, Morty hesitated before speaking. "Mum," he said softly, "you should maybe rest. You've been working too hard." It wasn't much, not a grand gesture, but Beth looked at him as though she had forgotten her son could see her at all. There was a flicker of warmth in her tired eyes, something unspoken but real. She didn't thank him, Beth rarely did, but she leaned back, let out a breath, and for a moment allowed herself to be still. The next day, Summer snapped at him for lingering too close to her door, but Morty didn't retreat as he once would have. Instead, he shrugged and said with a small, steady smile, "You don't have to pretend with me, you know. I get it." Summer rolled her eyes, dismissing him in the moment, but that night she knocked softly on his door and asked if he wanted to watch something with her. They didn't talk much, but the silence they shared was easier than before, like two travelers resting on the same road. Even Jerry, who often drifted in and out of Morty's days like a ghost, seemed touched by this subtle shift. Morty listened when his dad rambled about old hobbies or half-forgotten dreams, not with pity, but with a quiet patience that surprised them both. Jerry's words, fumbling and unsure, found a listener, and in return, Morty discovered a kind of gentleness that connected them. Two souls often overlooked, finding comfort in simply being heard. Through these small threads, Morty felt something blooming. His strength was not only his own, but something that could flow outward, weaving him closer to those he loved, even if love in this family was often tangled and unspoken. For years, he had believed himself the weakest link, the quiet shadow following behind Rick's brilliance. But here, in these fragile moments with his mother, his sister, his father, he began to sense a truth deeper than any adventure across galaxies. Strength was not only in standing alone, it was in holding others together when they were close to falling apart. And as Morty lay awake that night, the house quiet around him, he felt the weight of this new understanding settle into his chest. His family was far from perfect, but perhaps they didn't need perfection. They needed presence, patience, and the kind of steady light that endured in the background, unseen but constant. Morty, in his quiet way, was learning to be that light. Rick had been watching, not in the way Morty might notice, not with words or gestures, but in the silent, sidelong glances that slipped through the cracks of his usual detachment. He noticed the way Morty lingered at the table a little longer, speaking softer to Beth, or how Summer's sharp edges dulled slightly when Morty was around. He noticed Jerry laughing, awkward, nervous, but real, while Morty listened to one of his rambling stories. Rick didn't comment, not at first. He buried it under his usual haze of tinkering, muttered insults, and the clink of glass against glass. Yet something about it gnawed at him. Morty was changing. Rick had always thought of Morty as pliable, someone to mold, to drag along, a tool for grounding himself in adventures too dangerous for anyone else. But now, Morty seemed to be stepping outside of that role, carrying himself with a quiet strength that didn't come from Rick at all. It was unsettling, almost offensive, as though Morty was rewriting the terms of their bond without permission. And yet, beneath Rick's irritation there was something else, something he couldn't name or refuse to, a sliver of respect perhaps, or fear. One evening, Rick found Morty in the garage. The boy wasn't fiddling with gadgets or staring blankly into space. He was simply sitting, his back against the cluttered wall, as if waiting for something. Rick narrowed his eyes, masking curiosity with disdain. "What, you're waiting for the ceiling to drop some wisdom on you, Morty," he muttered, reaching for a tool. Morty didn't flinch. He just looked at Rick with a steadiness that was new, unsettling. "No, Rick, I was waiting for you." The words hung there, heavier than they had any right to be. Rick froze for a fraction of a second before covering it with a scoff. Well, congrats, you got me. Now what? You want a medal for wasting your evening?" But Morty didn't look away. His voice was calm even, lacking the nervous tremor that used to define him. "I just wanted to see if you'd sit with me for a while. No portals, no running. Just here." Rick opened his mouth for a sharp retort, but the boy's expression stopped him. There was no pleading in Morty's eyes, No desperation to be chosen or validated, only a quiet invitation, patient and unyielding. For reasons he couldn't explain, Rick sat. The silence that followed was thick, but not suffocating. It was the kind of silence Rick usually drowned in liquor, yet with Morty beside him, it felt tolerable. He hated that. Later that night, Rick lay in his room, staring at the ceiling. The boy was slipping from his grasp, not away but into something larger than the narrow space Rick had carved out for him. Morty was no longer the scared, fumbling child who needed Rick to survive. He was becoming his own center, his own gravity, and Rick, for the first time in a long while, felt the pull of something he didn't control. But control was everything to Rick. The universe was chaos, and he had spent his life bending it to his will, keeping it at bay through intellect, arrogance, and walls so high, even he couldn't see their tops. Now Morty threatened those walls without even trying, simply by being steady, by being present, by daring to need Rick less. Rick told himself it didn't matter, that he didn't care, that he could walk away, disappear into another timeline, another drink, another machine, but deep down, the unease clung to him. Because Morty's quiet strength wasn't just changing the boy, it was beginning to change him too. And that terrified him more than any monster across the stars. The next morning, Rick acted as though nothing had changed. He stomped around the garage, muttering to himself, while sparks danced from an overworked power coil, his hands moving with sharp precision, his flask never far from reach. Morty walked in, quiet but alert, and for a moment Rick almost expected him to sit against the wall again, waiting. Instead, Morty stood still, watching his grandfather work as though measuring the distance between them, trying to decide if it was worth crossing. Rick felt it, that unspoken pause, and he hated how it unsettled him. So he snapped, "Well, Morty, you gonna stand there gawking all day, or are you finally ready to do something useful?" Morty didn't roll his eyes or stumble into excuses. He just nodded. "Yeah, Rick, let's go." His voice was steady, almost calm. That tiny shift, just a note in the way Morty said it, struck Rick harder than it should have. For once Morty wasn't being dragged along. He was choosing. They stepped through the portal, swallowed by the shimmer of green light, and emerged into a wasteland of fractured stone and endless skies. The air vibrated with an unnatural hum, and jagged towers jutted from the ground like the ribs of some dead titan. Morty scanned the horizon, shoulders tense but not trembling. Rick, meanwhile, dug into his pocket, pulling out a small device with a scowl. "Stupid anomaly, stupid council, gotta clean up everyone's mess," he muttered. But deep down he knew this wasn't just another errand. This place wasn't random, it was one of those fractures he'd tried to bury long ago, a remnant of choices he never explained to anyone. Morty didn't know that, but Rick felt the weight pressing on him, as if the ground itself remembered. A low rumble split the silence. Shapes began to crawl from the shadows of the towers, angular and wrong, like broken reflections pieced together into mockeries of life. Their bodies shifted as they moved, unstable yet dangerous. Rick lifted his weapon without hesitation, but before he could fire, Morty stepped forward. "Rick," he said firmly, "what are they?" Rick's jaw tightened. He wanted to dismiss the question with his usual arrogance, but Morty's voice left no room for easy lies. "They echoes, Morty. Things that weren't supposed to exist. Mistakes." Morty didn't flinch at the word. Instead, he tightened his grip on the small blaster Rick had given him years ago. "Then we deal with them." The fight was sudden and fierce. The echoes lunged with screeches that rattled the bones, their limbs twisting unnaturally as if trying to rewrite themselves mid-strike. Rick fired controlled bursts, each shot precise, efficient. Morty, though less experienced, moved with a growing confidence, his aim steadier than Rick remembered, his steps sure even when the ground shook beneath him. For the first time, Rick didn't feel like he was shielding Morty. He felt like they were fighting together. When the last of the creatures dissolved into nothing, silence returned, heavy and echoing. Morty stood breathing hard, sweat clinging to his brow, but his hands didn't shake. He looked over at Rick, waiting for the usual dismissal or insult, but none came. Rick just stared back, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You're different, Morty," Rick said finally, his voice low, almost grudging. "Not sure if I like it." Morty's reply was simple, steady. "I'm not sure if I care, Rick." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wasteland stretched out around them, endless and hollow, yet between them there was a tension thick enough to feel. Morty wasn't the same boy Rick had dragged across galaxies. He was becoming something else, something Rick couldn't control, but maybe couldn't survive without. And though Rick would never admit it out loud, that thought cut deeper than any enemy they'd faced. The wasteland's silence lingered after the battle, broken only by the faint static hum that never truly left the air. Morty wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, eyes narrowing as he scanned the broken horizon. There was something about this place, something that unsettled him in ways he couldn't put into words. Rick, usually so quick to bark orders or crack a mocking remark, stood strangely still, his eyes locked on a distant tower half swallowed by the earth. "Rick," Morty said quietly, "you know this place, don't you?" The words hung heavier than the question deserved. Rick didn't look at him, but his silence was enough of an answer. He pulled a fresh cartridge from his belt and snapped it into his weapon, the motion sharper than usual, as though the act itself steadied him. Finally he spoke, his voice gruff, unwilling. "Doesn't matter what I know, Morty. What matters is we get to that tower before this whole dimension decides to tear itself apart." Morty followed without another word, though his suspicion didn't fade. The ground cracked beneath their feet as they walked, the stone groaning like something alive, and in the distance, flashes of distorted light shimmered like memories trapped in glass. The closer they came to the tower, the stronger the hum became, until it wasn't just sound, it was a vibration in their chests, an echo in their bones. Morty finally broke the silence. "You said those things were echoes, mistakes. What kind of mistakes make a whole world like this?" Rick stopped, his shoulders rigid. For a moment, Morty thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then Rick muttered, almost to himself, "The kind of mistakes you can't take back, the kind you think you bury, but they claw their way back out." Morty frowned, the weight of those words sinking into him. He remembered the way Rick had always deflected, always kept the past locked behind sarcasm and half-truths. But here, in this fractured wasteland, it felt like pieces of that past were clawing toward the surface, demanding to be seen. When they reached the tower, its surface shimmered like liquid stone, bending light in unnatural ways. Rick placed his hand against it, and the structure rippled outward like a disturbed pond. For an instant, Morty saw something reflected there, not his own face, but a younger Rick, gaunt and exhausted, cradling something in his arms. The image vanished before Morty could process it. "What was that?" Morty asked, his voice sharp. Rick pulled his hand back, avoiding Morty's gaze. "Nothing, just residual bleed. Don't read into." But Morty couldn't stop. The glimpse haunted him, burrowed into him, refusing to let go. For the first time, he realized how little he truly knew about Rick. Not just the science, not just the adventures, but the man himself. Every scar, every bottle, every late-night silence was a wall Rick had built, and Morty had never dared to climb, until now. As they stepped inside the tower, the air grew thick, heavy with shifting light. Hallways spiraled impossibly, each corridor bending into the next, as though the space itself couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Morty's stomach twisted at the disorientation. But Rick moved forward with grim certainty, like someone walking through a nightmare they had already lived. Finally, they entered a chamber where the hum reached a crescendo. At its center hovered a fractured core, shards of light orbiting like broken glass caught in a storm. It pulsed, irregular and pained, as if the world itself were bleeding from within. Rick's jaw tightened, his hands trembling despite his best effort to hide it. "This is it," he muttered, "the anchor, the thing holding this place together and tearing it apart." Morty stared at him, realization dawning. "Rick, you built this, didn't you?" The words hit harder than any weapon. Rick's silence, the way he wouldn't meet Morty's eyes, was answer enough. And Morty knew in that instant that whatever lay ahead wouldn't just be about saving another world. It would be about unearthing the truth Rick had spent a lifetime burying and deciding whether Morty was ready to see it. Morty's eyes widened as the fractured core pulsed before him, shards of light orbiting in irregular arcs, like pieces of a broken memory. The chamber vibrated with energy that felt almost alive, pressing against his chest and filling his ears with a low, resonant hum. He could see the faint outlines of shapes within the core, images twisting and folding in on themselves. Some looked like worlds he had visited, others like faces he almost remembered. And then, as his focus sharpened, he saw something unmistakable, versions of Rick, younger, older, tired, furious, sometimes laughing, sometimes rawing. All of them trapped in the light, all of them fragments of the same life. Rick's eyes stayed fixed on the core, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the energy flow with the precision of someone who knew every fracture intimately. This is what happens when you try to hold too much," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You think you can control it, keep it all from falling apart. But eventually the cracks show themselves, Morty. They always do." Morty stepped closer, the low hum pressing against him like a heartbeat he could feel in his bones. "Rick, all of this, you made it." Rick's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I did. But don't think for a second I meant it to be like this. Every shard, every echo, every twisted corner, you're seeing what happens when genius meets obsession. When someone thinks they can play God and still come out clean." The core pulsed again, brighter this time, and Morty felt a tug, a pull at the edges of his consciousness. Images flashed, Rick as a boy, alone and scared, grasping at impossible machines. Rick as a young man, drunk with potential but haunted by loss. Rick as the grandfather he knew, brimming with anger and brilliance, but running from the same ghosts. Morty's chest tightened, understanding in a way he never had before. This world, fractured and trembling, wasn't random. It was a map of Rick's choices, his regrets, the things he couldn't face. I don't understand everything, Rick," Morty said softly, his voice trembling not with fear but with awe. "But I think I get it. You've been carrying all of this alone and it's spilling out." Rick didn't answer immediately. He looked down, running a hand through his hair, the lines in his face deepening. "Yeah, I've been carrying it alone, and I didn't want anyone to see. Not you, not Beth, not anyone. Because once you see it, once you see the weight, it changes things, and I don't know if I can let it change me." Morty stepped closer, feeling the warmth of his own courage growing with each breath. "Maybe it's okay, Rick. Maybe you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Maybe I can help, even a little." Rick blinked, startled by the words, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't have a retort ready. Morty wasn't pleading, he wasn't begging, he wasn't trying to fix or control him. He was simply offering himself, steady and present, the kind of quiet support Rick hadn't realized he needed. The fractured core pulsed one last time, and a soft vibration rolled through the chamber, as though the world itself was listening. Rick exhaled, a long, shuddering sound, that carried decades of exhaustion and burden. For the first time, Morty saw a flicker of something softer in Rick's eyes. Not brilliance, not anger, not chaos, but something vulnerable, human and real. Morty reached out, brushing a hand over a shard of light that drifted close enough to touch. It didn't burn, didn't snap or vanish. It simply hummed against his skin, a gentle reminder that even fractured things could be held, even if just for a moment. Rick finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "You're braver than I thought, Morty. Not because you fight, not because you survive, but because you're willing to stand here with me. And that's rarer than anything I've ever built." Morty swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. He had seen Rick's mistakes, his regrets, the echoes of choices that spanned lifetimes. And yet, he had also seen Rick, human, flawed, and still reaching for connection despite it all. For the first time, Morty realized that bravery wasn't about facing monsters across the galaxy. It was about facing the people you love, facing the truth, and choosing to stay present, even when it hurt. And as they stood there together, the fractured world humming around them, Morty felt something shift, not fixed, not healed, but a quiet beginning. A fragile, shining star. The fractured core pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat caught between two worlds, and Rick and Morty circled it cautiously, their movements synchronized by necessity and a fragile trust that had begun to bloom. The chamber around them seemed to breathe, walls stretching and contracting as if testing their presence, probing whether they belonged or would be consumed. Morty's hands hovered over one of the stabilizing panels, unsure if touching it would help or hurt, and Rick, noticing his hesitation, leaned closer without a word. "Just follow my lead," Rick said quietly, his usual arrogance replaced by a cautious care. "The core isn't just energy, it's memory. Pain, mistakes you can't erase. You interfere wrong, and, well, we don't want to know what happens if we screw it up." Morty nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had seen echoes of Rick's past, shards of his regrets and failures, but now he understood the weight behind them. Each flicker of light in the core wasn't random, it was intentional, a reflection of choices made and abandoned, lives touched and broken. And yet, in all that chaos, there was beauty, the determination to keep trying, to keep holding, even when the universe seemed to push back against you. Together they began the slow work of aligning the fragments. Rick guided Morty's hands to the panels, showing him the rhythm of stabilizing the pulses. The boy copied, careful, precise, and soon the core's chaotic shimmer began to settle. Pieces orbiting in gentler arcs, resonating in time with one another. Rick watched him, half in disbelief, half in reluctant admiration. "You're not useless," Rick muttered, a statement so faint it might have been lost in the hum of the chamber, but Morty heard it. He didn't smile or reply, simply focused, letting the quiet satisfaction of being needed settle in his chest. It wasn't validation he sought, it was connection, and that was something entirely different, something deeper. As the hours passed, fragments of light began to merge into patterns that resembled constellations, memories knitting together instead of colliding. Morty's breathing synchronized with the pulses, a soft rhythm that matched the core itself. Rick, for the first time in decades, allowed himself to lean on someone else, not physically, but in a way that mattered just as much. He explained, softly, the significance of some shards, the choices that had birthed them, and the boy listened without interruption, absorbing the truths without judgment. Morty realized that stabilizing the core wasn't just a mechanical task, it was a meditation, a patient tending to fragile things that could shatter if rushed. He found that his quiet steadiness, the very thing that had seemed weakness in Rick's shadow, was exactly what was needed here, and Rick, in turn, began to recognize the value of presence, of patience, of enduring care. It was a lesson neither had expected to learn from one another. The final shards merged with a gentle pulse, the core settling into a soft luminescence that bathed the chamber in pale, forgiving light. Morty stepped back, letting his hands fall, and looked at Rick. For once, Rick didn't hide behind sarcasm or dismissal. His expression was open, almost vulnerable, and it startled Morty how small that gap of trust felt, and yet how significant. "You did good, Morty," Rick said finally. "No quips, no mocking, just acknowledgement. You helped hold something together that I couldn't on my own." Morty's chest swelled quietly. He didn't need more words. The weight of the moment shared and endured was enough. He had faced echoes of past mistakes, confronted the shadow of Rick's genius and grief, and found a place to stand without fear. As they left the chamber, the hum of the stabilized core fading behind them, Morty understood something important. Sometimes the greatest adventures weren't in galaxies far away, nor in battles won with blasters or brains. Sometimes they were in the slow, steady work of facing what hurts, bearing it together, and letting the quiet light of understanding shine through. The portal hummed around them as they prepared to leave the fractured world behind. Morty lingered a moment longer, staring at the soft glow of the stabilized core, feeling a strange kinship with the chaotic fragments that had once threatened to tear everything apart. In that hum, he sensed not just the remnants of Rick's mistakes, but a whisper of hope, fragile and persistent, that even the heaviest burdens could be carried with the right hands beside you. Rick clapped him on the shoulder, a rough gesture that carried more warmth than either of them had expected. "All right, Morty, we're done here. Let's get out before something decides to come crawling back." Morty followed, stepping through the portal, and the familiar hum of their own garage replaced the fractured resonance of the alien world. Everything seemed smaller, quieter, yet somehow heavier with meaning. Back home, the air felt different too, as if the universe outside their walls had pressed against them and left a residue of understanding behind. The first days after their return were subtle but noticeable. Morty noticed how Beth moved through the kitchen with less tension, how Summer paused in her room without rolling her eyes at him, how Jerry's awkward smiles lingered a second longer, as though he sensed Morty's quiet growth. Morty didn't announce any of it, didn't flaunt the lessons learned or the battles fought, but the small shifts were real. Presence, he realized, was more powerful than words. Rick, too, moved differently. He was still sharp-tongued, still impatient, but Morty caught glimpses of softness, the way he lingered near the kitchen when Beth was tired, the way he muttered instructions instead of insults, the way he occasionally let Morty's insight guide a decision instead of overriding it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Morty noticed, and with that recognition came a strange warmth, a quiet pride in seeing change, even in someone as stubborn and brilliant as Rick. One evening, Morty found himself sitting quietly on the porch, staring at the stars, reflecting on the fractured world they had left behind. He thought of the echoes, the shards of light, the memories trapped in the core, and he realized that the work hadn't been just about survival or problem-solving. It had been about understanding, about holding space for someone else's pain without needing to fix it, about learning to steady himself in the process. Rick joined him silently, a flask in hand, the night settling around them like a soft blanket. Neither spoke at first, the comfortable weight of shared experience filling the space. Finally, Rick said, "You know, Morty, not everyone gets to see the cracks in someone's life and still stick around." Morty looked up at him, catching the rare flicker of sincerity beneath the familiar cynicism. "I guess some cracks aren't meant to scare you away. Some are meant to be seen." Rick nodded slowly, staring at the stars as though reading something they alone could understand. "Yeah, I guess you're right, Morty. You're different now, stronger, and Maybe I needed to see that more than I wanted to admit. Morty smiled softly. Thanks, Rick. He didn't say more. Words felt unnecessary after everything they had faced. The night hummed around them, a quiet reminder that even in imperfection, even in fractured memories and unspoken regrets, connection could endure. And for the first time in a long while, Morty felt not like a boy being dragged along through life, but like someone capable of carrying, of understanding, of holding space for those he loved. Even when it was hard, the adventure hadn't ended with the core. It had begun at home in the small, quiet moments where growth could finally take root. Back home, the air felt lighter somehow, though the weight of the recent adventure lingered like an echo in every corner. Morty noticed the subtle shifts first in the way Beth moved through the house. She didn't speak over him as often, didn't sigh so sharply when he offered a suggestion or asked a question. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it made him feel as though he had grown a little taller overnight. Summer, too, paused in her room differently, glancing at him with a hint of acknowledgement rather than rolling her eyes, a tiny smile catching at the corner of her lips before she darted back into her world of music and scrolling. Morty realized that the quiet confidence he had found in the fractured world didn't vanish upon returning. It had followed him home, settling in like a second skin, and with that confidence came a patience he hadn't known he possessed. He listened more, spoke with intention, and even when Rick's sarcasm cut deep, he found the space to respond without immediately recoiling or panicking. One afternoon, Rick and Morty were in the garage. The usual hum of machinery surrounded them, but Morty noticed a shift in Rick's demeanor. He still grumbled and gestured wildly, but there were pauses, moments where Rick waited for Morty to weigh in, to point out details he might have overlooked. Morty hesitated at first, then found himself offering suggestions, small adjustments, nothing revolutionary, but enough to earn a nod or a rare, unspoken acknowledgement from Rick. "Not bad, Morty," Rick muttered, not looking up from his work. The words were clipped, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Morty felt a quiet warmth spreading through him. Recognition, he realized, wasn't always loud. It could arrive in the form of subtle trust. Even Jerry's awkward attempts at connection seemed easier to navigate. Morty found himself sitting through Jerry's long-winded explanations, not out of obligation but with patience, guiding the conversation gently when it faltered. The tension that often lingered in their home had softened slightly, replaced by the gentle understanding that comes when someone grows into steadiness without forcing it. That evening, Morty stood at the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a mixture of gold and soft pink, the clouds stretching thin and endless across the fading light. He thought of the fractured core, the echoes of Rick's past, the quiet bravery it had taken to stand beside him. He realized that the lessons weren't just about surviving adventures or fixing broken worlds. They were about understanding the fragility of people, of relationships, of trust. Rick appeared behind him, leaning lightly against the doorframe, a flask in hand, and a rare softness in his gaze. "You're handling things differently," Rick said, his voice low and almost uncertain. I notice it, and I guess I like it." Morty smiled faintly, feeling the subtle gravity of their shared growth. "Thanks, Rick," he said softly. "I'm just trying to be steady, like you taught me, even if it's not about portals or monsters." Rick grunted, a half-laugh escaping him. "Yeah, I get it. You're not just following me anymore. You're thinking for yourself, and maybe that's scarier for me than any of those monsters we've faced." Morty's chest tightened in a quiet satisfaction, the weight of that acknowledgement heavier than he could have expected. For the first time, he understood the ripple effect of his growth, not just on himself, but on the people around him. Every small shift, every patient word, every moment of presence could change the world quietly, invisibly, in ways that mattered. And as the sun sank completely and the house settled into the soft hum of evening, Morty realized that this was just the beginning. The adventure outside had transformed him, but the real work, the real courage, lay in navigating the spaces between hearts, the fragile balances of love and trust, patience and understanding, and for once, he felt ready. The portal flickered to life with its usual crackle and hum, painting the garage walls in strobing hues of green and blue. Rick paced, tinkering with the calibration knobs of the device, his eyes darting between readouts and Morty's hesitant figure. Morty, standing just a step behind him, felt the familiar nervous flutter, but this time it was tempered by a quiet steadiness he hadn't felt before. He had grown into his own presence, quiet, patient, perceptive, and the awareness of it gave him a subtle confidence. "All right, Morty," Rick said, voice sharper than the machine's hum. "We've got a temporal fluctuation on Glapflap Prime. If we don't stabilize the energy, the whole quadrant folds into a, well, never mind. You don't need the horror lecture. Just stay focused." Morty nodded, keeping his hands ready to follow Rick's lead, but also trusting himself enough to interject when he noticed the smallest discrepancies in readings. "Rick, the flux is stronger on the left side," he said softly, pointing to a panel. "If we don't redistribute it, it might overload before we reach the core." Rick froze mid-adjustment, eyes narrowing at Morty's suggestion. For a heartbeat, the usual sarcasm hovered on his lips, but he suppressed it. Instead, he stepped back, letting Morty manipulate the controls. "Huh, not bad, Morty," he muttered. "You actually see what I'm missing." As the flux began to stabilize under Morty's careful touch, Rick allowed himself a rare, quiet observation. His grandson was no longer just a passenger. Morty's attention to detail, his calm under pressure, was subtly influencing the outcome, guiding Rick's brilliance without overshadowing it. It was strange, almost uncomfortable for Rick, to let someone else's presence shape his decisions, but it was effective, undeniable. The portal hummed louder as they entered Glapflap Prime's orbit, a world of swirling clouds and iridescent storms that seemed alive, aware of their intrusion. Morty adjusted the energy distribution with precision, the hum of the portal and the alien wind blending into a rhythm he could feel in his chest. Rick glanced over occasionally, measuring, calculating, and slowly learning to rely on Morty's intuition. "You're improving, Morty," Rick said quietly, almost to himself, as they maneuvered through the storm. "Not just surviving, you're thinking ahead. He paused, unable to finish, the words sticking in his throat. For once, he didn't need to insult or dominate. The acknowledgement hung between them, heavy and genuine. Morty's hands moved steadily, guided by the lessons of patience and observation he had learned from the fractured core, from standing beside Rick without fear, and from understanding the weight of choices. "Rick, we need to recalibrate the left side thrusters before the storm spikes again," he suggested, his voice calm but insistent. Rick exhaled, letting Morty take the lead, and together they adjusted the systems. The storm's intensity softened, the chaotic winds bending around their vessel as though acknowledging the careful balance they had restored. In that moment, Rick realized that Morty's growth wasn't just a reflection of his own teaching. It was a force, subtle but transformative, guiding him to choices he might have ignored in his solitary brilliance. For Morty, the experience reinforced a quiet truth. Bravery wasn't always about facing monsters or danger. Sometimes it was about patience, presence, and the courage to trust yourself in the face of someone as overwhelming as Rick. The adventure continued, but the tension felt different now. They were partners, not just grandfather and grandson, not just reckless and reactive. They were aligned, moving through chaos with shared understanding. As Glapflap Prime's storms began to settle and the portal stabilized, Morty allowed himself a brief glance at Rick. The expression on Rick's face was unreadable, but in his eyes lingered a rare recognition, a silent acknowledgement of growth and trust. And for the first time, Morty felt certain, no matter what adventures lay ahead, this bond, this quiet evolving connection, would be their true guide. The multiverse stretched before them like an endless tapestry, vibrant threads of light weaving through darkness, each a reality in motion. Rick maneuvered the portal ship with precision, the storm around Glapflap Prime fading behind them, yet the air in the cabin felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension. Morty sat rigid, hands resting lightly on the console, alert to the subtlest flicker of energy. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they were screaming that some anomaly was waiting just beyond the visible threads. "Rick, something's off," Morty said softly, not panicking but pointing to a shifting cluster of light that didn't match any of their navigational markers. "That section, it's unstable, like it—" "Yeah," Rick interrupted, voice low and clipped, eyes narrowing. "I see it. It's a spatial dissonance, a tear in the multiversal fabric, and if we don't handle it carefully, it'll expand, maybe consume the nearby realities. Worst case scenario, Morty. A chain reaction across this quadrant, no pressure." Morty swallowed and nodded. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, but unlike before, he didn't hesitate. He could feel the lesson of the fractured core pulsing through him, the quiet steadiness, the presence of mind, the courage to act without needing to dominate. "Okay, then we do it together, step by step." Rick gave him a sidelong glance, surprise flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. He adjusted the ship's trajectory, keeping it steady while Morty monitored the anomalies, calling out patterns in the turbulence, identifying subtle energy fluctuations that Rick hadn't noticed. The collaboration was delicate, almost silent, a balance of trust and shared knowledge. As they approached the tear, the air shimmered, vibrating with raw energy. Morty felt it brush against him, a sensation both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a universe poised to unravel. He reached for the stabilizer controls, guided by intuition and a growing sense of responsibility. "Rick, the left flux is spiking again if we don't redistribute." Rick intervened, hands steadying Morty's movements, not taking over but guiding. "I got you, Morty. We do this together. Steady, slow, watch the feedback loop." The tension was palpable, each second stretching as the tear pulsed violently. Morty mirrored Rick's movements, their synchronization almost seamless, a dance of precision and trust. Slowly, methodically, the anomaly began to settle, the chaotic energy forming into a manageable, contained pattern. The tear's edges softened, the threat receding, leaving only the hum of power stabilized and under control. Morty exhaled, feeling the adrenaline drain, replaced by the calm satisfaction of shared achievement. Rick leaned back, a hand on Morty's shoulder this time, an unspoken recognition of the boy's growth. "You handled that impressively," Rick said quietly, the usual edge absent from his tone. "Not bad for a kid who used to freeze up in the garage." Morty smiled faintly, the weight of the compliment settling softly. He had survived fractured cores, alien storms, and now anomalies threatening entire realities. Yet the lesson remained the same. Courage was quieter now, steadier, rooted in presence and trust rather than reckless action or blind obedience. For a moment, they hovered there in the calm aftermath, the multiverse stretching infinitely around them, each reality intact because they had worked together. Morty realized, more deeply than ever, that the adventures weren't just about survival or science. They were about connection, about the slow, unspoken bonds that shaped them both. Rick finally broke the silence, voice low but tinged with something Morty rarely heard. "Pride. We make a pretty decent team, Morty. Don't get used to me saying it, but yeah, not bad." Morty laughed softly, a quiet exhale of relief and accomplishment. and as they set their course for home, the stars streaking past like silver threads. He understood that the anomaly had not only tested their skills, it had reinforced the quiet strength of their bond, a trust that would carry them through whatever the multiverse chose to throw their way next. The quiet that followed their return from the anomaly felt almost strange, like the house itself was holding its breath. Morty wandered through the rooms slowly, noting subtle shifts in the way light fell across the furniture, the faint hum of distant machinery in the garage, the soft echoes of voices carried from one corner to another. Everything seemed familiar, yet tinged with a new awareness, an understanding that the adventures beyond had changed not only him but the home he returned to. Beth was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with a measured calm Morty hadn't noticed before. She paused mid-chop, glancing at him with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've changed," she said, voice soft, like testing the word in the air before letting it settle. Morty nodded, unsure how to respond, sensing that no explanation could capture the depth of what he had experienced. Instead, he simply smiled back, the quiet exchange carrying more meaning than words could convey. Summer, sprawled on the couch with her headphones off for once, offered a raised eyebrow and a casual, "You're less annoying, I guess." It was awkward, fumbling praise, but Morty caught the sincerity hidden beneath the teasing tone. Even Jerry, fumbling through dishes at the sink, managed a glance that conveyed tentative pride without a single word spoken. The ripple of his growth had already begun, unnoticed but tangible, subtly altering the dynamics of his family. That evening Rick retreated to the garage as usual, but Morty lingered nearby, watching him work with quiet patience. He realized that Rick's demeanor, so often sharp and unyielding, had softened in subtle ways. The anomaly, the core, the storms, they hadn't only tested Morty, they had tested Rick too, pushing him toward recognition and restraint, toward understanding that not every solution required brilliance alone. Sometimes it required collaboration, trust, and quiet observation. Morty finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Rick, do you ever think about how all this, everything we've been through, changes us? Not just physically, or the adventures themselves, but us, inside." Rick froze, tools mid-air, and for a moment, Morty caught a glimpse of something rare in Rick's eyes. Reflection. "Yeah, sometimes," he admitted, voice low. "I don't like to think about it too long. Makes me feel vulnerable. But I see what you mean. We can't just walk away and honestly, maybe that's okay." The acknowledgement hung between them, quiet but weighty. Morty understood that growth wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was incremental, subtle, observed in the pauses between words, in the patience that replaced panic, in the small attentions given and received, and he felt for the first time a profound sense of continuity, not just with his grandfather, but with himself, with the quiet courage that had been building within him all along. As the night deepened, Morty wandered back to his room, pausing at the window to watch the stars stretch across the sky. Each light flickered like a memory, a choice, a lesson. He thought of the fractured core, the anomaly, the storms of Glapflap Prime, and realized that the threads of experience, however chaotic, had woven him into someone steadier, someone capable of quiet bravery. Rick's voice called softly from the garage, breaking the solitude without intruding. "Good night, Morty. Don't let the multiverse keep you up." Morty smiled, the echo of shared understanding settling warmly in his chest. "Good night, Rick." And as he turned back to the stars, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that the quiet moments, the gentle lessons, and the evolving bonds were the truest adventures of all. The garage smelled faintly of ozone and solder, the lingering aroma of countless inventions and experiments. Morty watched Rick from a distance, noticing the subtleties he had once overlooked, the way Rick's fingers hovered over controls before making a move, the careful attention to energy readings, the slight furrow of concentration that betrayed his curiosity and, perhaps, an unspoken respect. Morty realized he no longer felt like a passenger here. He had grown into someone capable of observing, assessing, and even suggesting without hesitation, and that subtle shift was already changing how Rick interacted with him. "Morty," Rick said, glancing up, "I need a hand with this calibration. The multiverse flux from earlier, it's leaving residual instability, and I don't want any surprises." Morty stepped forward, steady and measured. He studied the controls, noting patterns and inconsistencies, a quiet awareness guiding his decisions. "If we redistribute this energy along the secondary conduits, it should stabilize faster, but we need to monitor the feedback loops closely in case the residuals spike again." Rick raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not bad, Morty. You're actually thinking ahead now. I see it." Morty's chest warmed slightly at the acknowledgement. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on the delicate adjustments, guiding the calibration with precision. The hum of machinery vibrated softly through the air, a rhythm that Morty felt in his chest, grounding him in the task at hand. Rick watched quietly, occasionally making small adjustments himself, but largely letting Morty lead. As the system began to stabilize, the tension in the room softened. Morty felt a quiet pride, not the kind born of praise or recognition, but the deeper satisfaction of understanding his own capabilities. Rick, in turn, seemed more reflective than usual, the usual sharpness in his tone replaced by a subtle patience. "You know," Rick muttered, almost to himself, this partnership thing, maybe it's not as terrible as I thought." Morty smiled faintly, the words echoing the unspoken truth that had been growing between them, that their bond, forged in chaos and adventure, was evolving into something steadier, stronger, and quieter than either had anticipated. Later, as they stepped outside, the evening air carried the faint scent of rain and ozone. Morty lingered for a moment, watching the sky stretch into deep indigo, streaked with the last traces of twilight. The quiet world around him felt different now, more open, more expansive, not because it had changed, but because he had. Beth's voice called from inside the house, soft and curious. "Morty, did you fix that thing in the garage?" Morty turned, meeting her gaze with calm assurance. "Yeah, I think it's stable now. Nothing should blow up tonight." She smiled, a small, real smile that didn't need embellishment. "Good job, Morty. I noticed you've been different lately." He nodded, feeling the gentle weight of her recognition. The subtle shifts in himself, the patience, the focus, the courage were rippling outward, touching the people around him, shaping their perceptions, and in small ways, their interactions. As the night deepened, Morty found himself sitting on the porch, gazing at the stars. The hum of distant galaxies and multiverses seemed almost within reach, and he felt a serene awareness settle in him that growth was quiet, incremental, and profoundly meaningful. He had learned to navigate chaos not with panic or defiance, but with presence and understanding. Rick joined him silently, flask in hand, offering no words but a quiet acknowledgement in his gaze. Morty didn't need to speak. The silence itself was affirmation, the kind that only comes from shared experiences and truth. And as the stars stretched across the sky, Morty realized that the real adventure wasn't the anomalies or the storms, it was the slow, steady shaping of self, the subtle weaving of connection and trust, and the quiet strength to carry both into whatever unknown lay ahead. The hum of the portal filled the garage, soft but insistent, vibrating through the floorboards and into Morty's chest. Today, Rick had decided they needed to check on a minor spatial anomaly that had begun affecting a small cluster of universes. Morty stood beside him, the subtle confidence he had developed, guiding his gaze over the controls. He no longer felt like a passenger, no longer froze when Rick barked instructions or when the unexpected occurred. Instead, he observed, anticipated, and acted with a patience that Rick noticed, even if he didn't always admit it. The anomaly unfolded before them like a living ribbon of energy, twisting and folding in patterns that seemed both chaotic and deliberate. "Morty, we've got to stabilize this before it spreads," Rick said, voice tight with concentration. "And this time, I need you paying extra attention. One wrong move, and well, you know the drill." Morty nodded, feeling the pulse of the energy as it licked the edges of the ship. He guided Rick's adjustments with steady hands, monitoring fluctuations and suggesting small, precise interventions. "If we redistribute the energy along the tertiary conduits, it can prevent the overflow," he said, voice calm. Rick glanced at him, one eyebrow raised, then allowed him to make the adjustments. As the anomaly began to settle under Morty's guidance, Rick's expression softened ever so slightly. "You're handling this better than I expected," he muttered. It wasn't praise exactly, but it carried weight. Morty felt a quiet warmth at the acknowledgement, realizing that the skills he had cultivated, the patience, the awareness, the calm, were making a tangible difference. Once the anomaly was stabilized, the two of them drifted quietly in the aftermath, watching the ribbon of energy fold into itself, harmless for now. Morty felt the hum of accomplishment, but it wasn't the kind that demanded recognition or applause. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had acted with thought, with clarity, and with presence. Later, back at home, the subtle effects of his growth rippled through his interactions. Beth glanced at him while setting the table and offered a small nod of appreciation, her eyes holding a newfound respect. Summer, unusually reflective, asked him for advice on a problem she had been struggling with, and he found himself answering thoughtfully, not out of obligation, but with genuine care and calm guidance. Even Jerry, fumbling through his usual awkward attempts at conversation, seemed more at ease in Morty's presence, as if the steady energy Morty carried softened the edges of tension around him. That evening, Morty wandered to the porch, the sky painted in shades of violet and gold. He thought about the anomaly, the delicate balance he had helped restore, and the subtle ways his own growth was influencing the world around him. He realized that courage wasn't always about rushing into danger or reacting with frantic energy. It was about understanding, patience, and the quiet decision to act with clarity when it mattered most. Rick joined him, silent for a long moment, the flask in hand and eyes fixed on the horizon. The night was calm, the multiverse stretching endlessly beyond the faint glow of distant stars. Morty didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence itself was a conversation, a shared acknowledgement of growth, trust, and the evolving bond between them. And as the stars twinkled above, Morty understood that the adventures, the anomalies, and the chaos of countless worlds were only part of the story. The true journey was within, learning to navigate uncertainty, building trust, and discovering that even in the wildest corners of the multiverse, quiet presence and careful action could change everything. The portal shimmered faintly as Rick adjusted the controls, the hum of the multiverse threading through the garage like a quiet lullaby. Morty stood nearby, hands hovering over the panels, aware of every flicker and pulse. Today's journey was not about chasing anomalies or rushing into crises. It was about observation, anticipation, and understanding the subtle flows of energy that threaded through their universe-hopping adventures. Rick glanced at him, the usual edge in his eyes softened, as if silently acknowledging that Morty's presence had become something more than just company. It was guidance. "Morty, keep your eyes on the flux," Rick muttered, voice lower than usual, almost reverent. "I'm adjusting the portal's phase alignment. If we're off by a fraction, well, you know how bad it can get." Morty nodded, steady and composed. "I see it, Rick. The left side energy spike, redirect it through the auxiliary conduit. It should smooth out the phase fluctuations. His words were calm, deliberate, carrying the quiet confidence that had grown through countless adventures. Rick allowed him to make the adjustments, feeling the unusual comfort of letting someone else take the lead without needing constant oversight. As the portal stabilized and the hum softened into a gentle resonance, Rick leaned back, watching Morty work with a mixture of pride and something he rarely admitted. Morty's careful observation, patience, and insight had transformed what would have been chaotic moments into deliberate, controlled outcomes. Rick realized that the growth he had always demanded from Morty was now reciprocating, shaping him as well, softening the edges of his impulsive brilliance with Morty's steadiness. Once the portal aligned fully, they stepped through, entering a universe of soft colors and drifting light, a quiet, almost dreamlike reality. Morty marveled at the gentle rhythm of it, the subtle harmony that required no interference, only careful navigation. He guided Rick through the currents, pointing out energy flows and heartal anomalies that even Rick hadn't anticipated. And for the first time, Rick didn't feel the need to correct or dominate. He simply followed, learning through observation, mirroring Morty's patience and precision. Back in the garage, the residual hum of their journey lingered, as if the multiverse itself had imprinted a calm rhythm onto the room. Morty noticed the small ways his growth rippled outward. Rick was quieter, more contemplative. Beth's glances carried a trace of new understanding. Summer sought his advice without mockery. Jerry for once seemed less awkward around him. Morty understood that the subtle shift in himself had begun to shape not only his adventures, but the world around him in ways he hadn't yet fully grasped. That night, Morty sat at the edge of the porch, stars stretching endlessly above him, each one flickering like a reminder of countless choices, countless moments of quiet courage. Rick joined him without speaking, and together they watched the infinite tapestry of the multiverse, the silence a shared acknowledgement of growth, trust, and the evolving bond between them. Morty realized, as the night deepened and the universe hummed softly in the distance, that the real adventures were not just the anomalies and the crises, they were the quiet, steady lessons, the moments of trust, the slow shaping of self and connection that would carry them through whatever chaos the multiverse held next. And in that understanding, he found a gentle peace, the kind that comes from knowing that growth, presence, and shared courage are sometimes the truest forms of strength. The morning light crept softly through the windows, casting long, gentle shadows across the garage. Morty leaned over the portal console, tracing the faint lines of residual energy from their last adventure. The hum of the multiverse lingered in the room, subtle, almost comforting, as if the fabric of reality itself had taken a quiet breath after their careful navigation. Rick was nearby, tinkering with a device that buzzed with low, irregular pulses, eyes flicking between readings and Morty's steady hands. "Morty," Rick began, voice quieter than usual, "we've got a ripple forming in a neighboring dimension. Nothing catastrophic yet, but it's the kind of subtle distortion that can grow if ignored." Morty nodded, feeling that familiar pulse of calm determination. He studied the readings, tracing the irregularities with precise movements. "If we redirect the energy along the secondary stabilizers and monitor the feedback loops, we can contain it before it escalates," he suggested, his tone measured and confident. Rick watched, allowing Morty to take the lead, adjusting his own hands only when Morty indicated a small calibration tweak. The portal shimmered as they entered the affected dimension, a quiet world of drifting light and soft, undulating forms. The anomally wasn't violent. It was subtle, like a slow ripple through water, but Morty sensed its potential for chaos. He guided Rick carefully, observing patterns, predicting shifts, and making incremental adjustments. Each motion was deliberate, each decision tempered with patience and quiet insight. Rick, usually the one driving solutions, followed with trust, letting Morty shape the interaction. As the anomaly gradually stabilized, Morty noticed something new, the resonance of his own confidence affecting the rhythm of the multiverse around them. The gentle steadiness he had cultivated seemed to ripple outward, aligning energy flows that had previously resisted control. Rick glanced at him, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Not bad, Morty. You're starting to intuit the flow," he said, words clipped but carrying an unusual warmth. When they returned to their home universe, the shift in Morty's presence was evident in small, tangible ways. Beth offered a look of quiet approval as he passed. Summer sought his advice without sarcasm, and even Jerry lingered in conversation, drawn by the calm steadiness Morty now carried naturally. The subtle growth he had nurtured in chaos was shaping his world in ways he hadn't yet fully understood. That night, Morty found himself on the porch, gazing at the infinite expanse above. Stars stretched endlessly, a tapestry of possibilities. And he realized the quiet truth he had been discovering over time, that courage wasn't loud, and growth wasn't always immediate. Sometimes, it was found in the steady attention to detail, in the calm guidance through chaos, and in the quiet influence one could exert without force or demand. Rick joined him after a moment, settling into the chair beside Morty without a word. The silence was companionable, filled with mutual recognition of lessons learned and trust built. Morty allowed himself to rest in that moment, understanding that their adventures weren't just tests of survival or intelligence, they were exercises in presence, patience, and the deepening of bonds that transcended the multiverse itself. And as the night deepened and the stars shimmered, Morty felt the quiet power of his own growth, a strength born not of bravado but of steady presence, observation and truth. He knew that the challenges ahead, no matter how unpredictable or strange, could be met with this calm resolve, and that this, more than any portal or invention, was the true adventure unfolding within him. The air felt heavier than usual that morning, not with danger, but with the quiet weight of choices. Morty stood at the edge of the garage, watching Rick fine-tune a device that pulsed with soft violet light. The portal flickered intermittently, like a heartbeat out of sync, and Morty sensed the subtle tremor beneath the surface. Today's mission wasn't about anomalies in the multiverse. It was about judgment, ethics, and the small but powerful consequences of decisions made in silence. "Morty," Rick said, voice lower than typical, almost contemplative, "there's a situation on Nexus 7. Technically it's minor, but your choice there could ripple into complications. So I'm not telling you what to do, but I need you alert." Morty nodded, feeling the familiar calm that had grown inside him settle like a steady hand over his chest. He studied the readings, observed the portal's flickers, and tried to anticipate the consequences. For the first time, he realized that responsibility wasn't about acting fast. It was about acting deliberately, considering each subtle effect of his choices. The journey to Nexus 7 was quiet, the multiverse stretching around them in serene waves of color. Morty's mind traced every possibility, weighing outcomes that didn't just affect themselves, but countless others. Rick, usually the one making rapid-fire decisions, allowed him space, the hum of the portal echoing their mutual understanding. There was trust here, a fragile but solid bond that recognized Morty's growing judgment. Arriving on the world, Morty saw the problem unfold. A colony of sentient energy beings trapped in a shifting lattice of unstable matter. Rick would have acted quickly, perhaps destructively, to resolve the issue, but Morty hesitated. He observed the subtle rhythms, the patterns of motion, the way the beings interacted with each other and with their environment. Instead of immediate intervention, he suggested small, precise adjustments to stabilize the lattice slowly, letting the creatures regain autonomy without force. Rick watched, leaning against a smooth, crystalline wall, a rare quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'd have blasted it," he muttered. "But your way's working." It was a quiet victory, but not one that demanded applause. Morty felt something deeper, a connection to consequence, a resonance with care and understanding that wasn't measured in explosions or accolades. The colony stabilized, shifting into harmony with the lattice, and Morty realized that the power to influence didn't always require dominance. Sometimes it was patience, observation, and the courage to act thoughtfully. Returning home, Morty carried the subtle weight of moral insight with him. Beth noticed the difference in his gait, the calm certainty in his voice, and even Summer's questions seemed to seek reflection rather than immediate answers. Jerry lingered longer than usual in conversation, sensing the change in the energy Morty exuded. The ripples of quiet judgment spread beyond Morty himself, influencing the family dynamic in ways that were gentle but tangible. That night, on the porch, Morty stared at the multiverse above, shimmering in the darkness, alive with infinite possibility. He realized that growth wasn't just about skill or courage, it was about understanding the quiet power of choice, the responsibility carried in each measured action. Rick joined him, silent but present, the hum of distant universes threading through the night. In the stillness, Morty allowed himself to exhale fully, recognizing the depth of his own evolution. The adventures, the crises, and the strange, beautiful chaos of the multiverse were only the surface. Beneath it all lay understanding, judgment, and a quiet bravery that could shape worlds not with force but with care. And as the stars flickered softly above, Morty understood that he was no longer just a participant in Rick's adventures. He was a guiding presence, a calm anchor in the swirling uncertainty, and a young man discovering the quiet, profound strength that comes from thoughtful action. The quiet of the garage was almost startling that morning, broken only by the low hum of residual portal energy and the faint squeak of the floorboards under Morty's feet. He leaned over the control panel, reviewing readings that suggested a subtle, temporal shift, a delicate fracture in the weave of reality that demanded careful handling. Rick was nearby, hands deep in circuitry, muttering to himself in a low, almost meditative rhythm. Today felt different. Morty sensed the shift, not just in the multiverse, but within the patterns of his own perception, a quiet awareness that stretched his understanding beyond reaction and into foresight. "Morty," Rick said without looking up, voice unusually soft, "this one's tricky. If we misalign the sequence even a fraction, we risk, well, let's just say it'd be messy." Morty nodded, feeling the familiar steadiness settle into his chest. He traced the patterns on the monitor, interpreting the subtle fluctuations with a patience that had grown over countless journeys. "We can phase the conduits incrementally," he suggested, "and synchronize with the secondary temporal markers. It'll minimize the ripple effect." His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying an authority that had not existed before, even if Rick would never outright acknowledge it. As they activated the portal, the world around them shimmered and folded, light bending softly, edges of reality blurring into waves of color. Morty guided Rick's adjustments with precision, each correction a quiet assertion of his judgment. Rick, unusually quiet, allowed himself to follow, occasionally glancing at Morty with an expression that combined incredulity and reluctant trust. The anomaly required patience, not force, and Morty's careful interventions began to harmonize the fracture rather than suppress it. When the temporal shift finally stabilized, Morty felt a subtle sense of triumph, not the exhilaration of victory over chaos, but the quiet satisfaction of stewardship. He had navigated the delicate balance of consequence and care, and in doing so, shaped the outcome without resorting to rash measures. Rick nodded once, a small gesture, the kind that carried weight beyond words. Morty understood that he was no longer just a companion or a follower. He was a guide, a stabilizing presence in the unpredictable tides of the multiverse. Returning to the garage, the air was still infused with the gentle hum of residual energy. Morty moved with a new awareness, noticing the small ways his growth was affecting the rhythm of their home. Beth regarded him with subtle respect. Summer sought his insight without sarcasm, and even Jerry lingered, caught in the quiet authority Morty now carried effortlessly. The ripples of careful action extended beyond the anomalies and into the lives of those around him, a silent influence that required neither explanation nor recognition. Later, on the porch, Morty sat beneath the stretching night sky, stars scattered like soft, distant lanterns. He contemplated the journey, the small, deliberate choices, the moments of observation, the steady hand in the face of uncertainty. He realized that the real lessons of adventure were rarely loud or dramatic. They were quiet, cumulative, shaping understanding, responsibility, and the ability to act with measured courage. Rick joined him after a long pause, settling into the chair beside him. They shared the silence, not in emptiness, but in acknowledgement of the growth between them. Morty understood that the multiverse, in all its chaos and wonder, was not merely a backdrop for adventure. It was a teacher, and he was learning its language. And as the stars blinked softly above, Morty felt the profound weight and quiet joy of his own evolution. He was no longer simply reacting to the universe. He was engaging with it thoughtfully, patiently, and with care. In that stillness, he sensed that the true journey, responsibility, trust, and subtle guidance was only just beginning. The morning light was muted, filtered through clouds that hung low and heavy over the garage. Morty stood at the edge of the portal console, tracing the faint undulations of energy that hinted at something new, subtle, and deeply unsettling. The previous successes, the careful stabilizations, the quiet mastery of small consequences, had not prepared him for this. The anomaly waiting beyond the portal was not a simple fluctuation or a pattern to be corrected. It carried weight, a strange moral complexity that pressed gently yet insistently against the edges of his judgment. Rick leaned over the readings, unusually silent. The lines on the monitor pulsed slowly in a rhythm that seemed almost sentient. "Morty, this one's not about skill or speed," he murmured. "It's perception. You're going to have to feel it more than you see it." Morty took a deep breath, grounding himself in the quiet he had cultivated. The hum of the portal became a steady rhythm beneath his thoughts, a companion to his growing sense of clarity. As they stepped through, the world beyond the portal unfolded into a haze of shifting light and translucent forms, a dimension that seemed alive with decisions made long before their arrival. Morty's heart beat steadily, each pulse attuning him to the currents that ran beneath the surface of reality. Here the challenge was subtle. Entire societies of beings existed in delicate tension, their fates intertwined with choices that were no longer visible in immediate action. Morty sensed the consequences radiating outward, fragile threads threatening to unravel. Without the usual fanfare, he began to guide the flow, not through force but through careful suggestion, aligning energies, nudging patterns, and allowing the inhabitants to rediscover equilibrium on their own. Each small adjustment carried weight, and Morty realized that the quiet patience he had honed was now a tool of immense responsibility. Rick watched him, leaning back against a floating crystalline formation, observing with a rare serenity. "I'd have barged in," he muttered, half to himself. You're seeing it differently." Morty only nodded, focusing on the minute harmonies of motion and consequence. There was no applause here, no grand resolution, only the subtle, unfolding acknowledgement that his presence and the care with which he exercised it could shape outcomes without overt intervention. As the anomaly stabilized, the world around them settled into an almost imperceptible balance, the consequences of their quiet attentions rippling outward. Morty felt a gentle sense of fulfillment, Not the exhilaration of success, but the serene satisfaction of responsibility met thoughtfully. Returning home, he noticed the shifts in the rhythms of daily life. Beth's gaze carried a trace of respect. Summer's questions sought insight rather than correction, and Jerry lingered a bit longer, sensing the quiet authority Morty now embodied. That evening, Morty sat on the porch, the stars stretching endlessly above like soft, distant promises. He reflected on the journey, every subtle choice, every quiet act of attentiveness, every moment of measured courage. He understood now that growth was not loud or immediate. It unfolded patiently, accumulating in ways that shaped not just his life, but the lives of those around him. Rick joined him after a pause, settling into the chair beside him without speaking. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared acknowledgement of lessons learned and trust earned. Morty allowed himself to feel the depth of his own evolution. He was no longer simply reacting, but guiding, shaping and understanding with quiet discernment. The multiverse was not merely a backdrop for adventure, it was a canvas, and he was learning to paint with careful, deliberate strokes. As the night deepened and the stars shimmered softly above, Morty realized that the truest journeys were not in the chaos they faced, but in the steady, careful cultivation of presence, responsibility and insight. And in that quiet, reflective understanding, he felt a profound peace, knowing that each choice, each moment of calm attentiveness, could echo far beyond himself, shaping worlds in ways gentle yet infinitely meaningful. The night was soft, almost imperceptibly warm. The stars stretched across the sky like quiet witnesses to all that had unfolded. Morty sat on the porch, knees drawn close, tracing the constellations with a slow, deliberate gaze. The multiverse felt calmer now, not because it had grown less vast or strange, but because he had learned to move within it, with patience, care, and a quiet understanding of his own influence. Each adventure, each ripple of choice, each small act of attention had led him here, to this gentle evening of reflection. Rick joined him, settling into the chair beside Morty, the familiar hum of his presence, a comforting anchor. Neither spoke at first. Words were unnecessary. The silence carried the weight of everything they had faced together, missteps, triumphs, and the subtle, unspoken lessons that had shaped them both. Morty felt the depth of his own growth, the steady calm he had cultivated, the quiet authority of judgment, and the patience to observe, guide, and let unfold. He thought of all the moments where he had felt doubt, fear, or hesitation. Each one now seemed like a stone in a path that led toward understanding, toward the ability to act thoughtfully rather than impulsively. And he realized that the true journey had never been through the chaos of the multiverse, but through the quiet shaping of his own mind, his own presence, and his own moral compass. Rick finally spoke, voice low and uncharacteristically tender. "You've changed, Morty. Not just in what you do, but in how you see. It's subtle, but it's real." Morty nodded, feeling a warmth that had little to do with approval and everything to do with recognition. He understood that growth wasn't always loud or dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and cumulative, shaping not just actions, but relationships, understanding, and the very way one moved through the universe. The night deepened, and Morty felt a soft, reflective peace settle over him. The multiverse stretched endlessly above, filled with infinite possibility, yet he felt grounded, steady, and capable. The lessons of patience, judgment, and quiet courage had taken root. He understood now that his presence mattered, not through heroics or loud decisions, but through calm attentiveness, careful guidance, and thoughtful action. As the stars shimmered, Morty closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the stillness to fill him completely. He thought of Beth, Summer, Jerry, and Rick, not as companions of circumstance, but as witnesses and participants in a journey of subtle growth, trust, and understanding. The night air carried a soft, reassuring hum, the kind that promised continuity, presence, and the quiet rhythm of life unfolding gently. And in that serene reflection, Morty felt a final deep exhale of understanding. The chaos of the multiverse was still there, vast and unpredictable, but he had discovered the quiet strength to move within it, thoughtfully, to guide without demanding, to act without force, and to trust in the subtle power of careful presence. And somewhere, he's still out there observing, learning and guiding in small, profound ways, shaping worlds quietly, yet meaningfully. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.